By the early 1960s, Rod Serling was already one of the most recognizable voices on American television. He wasn't an actor. He wasn't a network executive. He wasn't even comfortable being on camera. He was a writer, and in television, that alone made his position uncertain. To the audience at home, Serling appeared calm, confident, authoritative. When he stepped into frame, cigarette in hand, he spoke with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what he wanted to say and wasn't afraid to say it. Behind the scenes, though, the reality was very different. Fantasy, sci-fi, nostalgia, rerun zone. Serling was overworked, frustrated, and constantly negotiating with forces that had little interest in moral clarity. Sponsors worried about offending customers. Networks worried about controversy. Advertisers worried about brand image. And somewhere in the middle of all that sat a writer who believed that television could be more than just a harmless distraction. In the early days of live television drama, Serling tried to tackle real subjects: war, injustice, prejudice, moral compromise. And again, he watched the scripts quietly reshaped. Not censored outright, not banned, just softened. Names changed, motivations blurred, meanings diluted until the point no longer landed where he intended. It was a lesson he learned the hard way. You could say almost anything on television, as long as you didn't say it too clearly. The Twilight Zone didn't come from creative freedom, it came from that realization. Science fiction wasn't an escape for Serling, it was a workaround, a way to talk about the present while pretending to talk about somewhere else. Monsters could stand in for the mob mentality. Alien worlds could mirror American fears. Futures gone wrong could expose current moral failures, all without triggering the alarms of sponsors and network standards departments. And for a while, it worked. The Twilight Zone gave Serling a voice that could finally reach the audience without being filtered line by line. But it also placed an enormous burden on him. He wasn't just hosting the show. He was driving it, writing, rewriting, producing, overseeing, and constantly pushing against the limits of what television would allow. On screen, he looked composed. Off screen, the pace was relentless. As the show grew in stature, something else happened. Something Serling hadn't anticipated. He became more than a writer or a host, he became a symbol. To the public, Rod Serling came to represent intelligence on television, integrity, moral seriousness. He was invited onto talk shows, asked to speak at universities, quoted in newspapers as if he were a cultural referee. Viewers trusted him. They believed that if Serling was involved, the story would matter. That reputation followed him everywhere, and it brought its own weight. The Twilight Zone was no longer just a television series. It was expected to mean something every single week. Episodes weren't judged only as entertainment, but as statements. When a story fell short, critics noticed. When a metaphor felt unclear, viewers questioned it. And when an episode failed to land, the disappointment felt personal. For Serling, this created a quiet tension. He'd built the show to avoid being boxed in by sponsors, but success had created a different kind of confinement. The audience now expected him to speak with authority on every subject: war, prejudice, fear, power, human nature itself. And television, with its tight schedules and constant deadlines, was a difficult place to sustain that level of expectation. Serling understood that not every episode could carry the same weight. But he also knew that stepping back would risk diluting the voice he'd fought so hard to protect. And so, he stayed involved. Too involved. He read everything, rewrote constantly, took on more responsibility than was reasonable, because the alternative felt worse. The irony was unavoidable. The Twilight Zone had been created to preserve his ability to speak honestly. But now, honesty came with the burden of consistency. And consistency, week after week, demanded more than television was designed to give any one person. What began as a solution slowly became another form of pressure. And as the years went on, the cost of always having to speak sideways began to add up. That urgency didn't come from television. It was already there long before he sat behind a typewriter in New York. In 1943, Rod Serling joined the Army and volunteered to become a paratrooper. He was barely out of his teens when he was sent to the Pacific, where war was chaotic, close, and unforgiving. There were no clean victories, no tidy moral lessons, just long stretches of tension, punctuated by moments of sudden violence. Serling saw friends killed. He was wounded himself, and like many who came home from the war, he carried more back with him than medals or stories he wanted to tell. He carried questions about randomness, about authority, about how easily human life could be reduced to a statistic or a decision made far away. Writing became a way to process that. After the war, Serling didn't drift into television looking for fame. He arrived with something to say. Early on, his scripts weren't subtle. They were direct, emotional, and morally pointed. They reflected a worldview shaped by combat, one that distrusted simple answers and rejected the idea that suffering always had a clean purpose. Live television drama in the late 40s and early 50s seemed like the perfect place for that kind of voice. It was immediate. It was intimate. It reached into American living rooms while the memory of the war was still fresh. And for a moment, it felt like television might actually be willing to wrestle with uncomfortable truths. But that moment didn't last long. As sponsors gained influence and television became more cautious, Serling's war-shaped instincts began to clash with a system that preferred reassurance over reflection. Scripts inspired by real events were questioned. Characters were softened. Causes were obscured. Anything that hinted too clearly at responsibility or blame was quietly pushed aside. For Serling, this wasn't an abstract debate about artistic freedom. It felt personal. He'd seen what happened when people followed orders without questioning them. He had lived inside systems where human cost was an afterthought. And now he was watching a new kind of authority decide which stories were safe enough to be told. By the time he realized that television was never going to allow him to speak plainly for very long, he was already looking for another way in. By the mid-1950s, the pattern was familiar. Rod Serling would submit a script rooted in something real, an injustice, a public controversy, a moral failure that still had sharp edges. And somewhere between the typewriter and the broadcast, those edges would disappear. Sponsors didn't demand outright silence. They didn't have to. They asked for adjustments. A line here, a name there. A motivation softened just enough to avoid discomfort. Sometimes entire themes were redirected, not because they were untrue, but because they were too recognizable. Serling learned that the most dangerous stories weren't fictional ones. They were the ones that reminded viewers of something they'd rather not think about during dinner. For a while, he tried to work within that system. He revised. He negotiated. He compromised more than he wanted to. But each concession came at a cost, and over time, that cost became harder to ignore. The story still aired, but they no longer said what he meant. Eventually, Serling stopped keeping his frustration private. In interviews and public appearances, he began speaking openly about television censorship. Not in vague terms, but plainly. He talked about sponsors shaping content, about writers being overruled by advertisers who had no interest in storytelling, only safety. About a medium that claimed to reflect American life while carefully avoiding its most uncomfortable truths. It was an unusual move for someone in his position. Television was still a young industry, and writers were expected to be grateful, just to be there. Speaking out meant risking assignments, relationships, and future work. Serling did it anyway, and in doing so, he backed himself into a corner. You see, once you publicly accuse the system of silencing you, you either have to retreat or you have to find a way to prove your point. Writing straightforward social drama was no longer an option. Too many eyes were watching. Too many doors had quietly begun to close. That's when the solution took shape, not as a bold, creative leap, but as a necessity. If he couldn't speak directly about the world as it was, he would build a different one. a place far enough removed to feel harmless, but close enough to be unmistakable. Science fiction wasn't chosen because it was trendy. It was chosen because it could slip past the gatekeepers. And with that decision, almost reluctantly, Rod Serling stepped into the Twilight Zone, a place where truth could survive, so long as it wore a mask. When the Twilight Zone was finally approved, it wasn't greeted as a revolution. To the network, it was a gamble, an unusual anthology series hosted by a writer who'd already made himself inconvenient. Science fiction was still considered niche, even risky. For Serling, the approval didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a narrow opening, one that might close at any moment if he didn't make it work. From the beginning, he understood the unspoken rule. If the show failed, it would be quietly blamed on the genre. If it succeeded, it would only be tolerated so long as it stayed under control. So he took control himself. Serling didn't just host the series, he became its backbone. He wrote the majority of the scripts, rewrote others, oversaw story development, and served as the public face of the show. Week after week, he turned out tightly structured morality plays disguised as fantasies, stories that had to function as drama, allegory, and entertainment all at once. The pace was relentless. There was always another script due, another rewrite demanded, another episode heading into production. And because Serling didn't fully trust the system that had already tried to soften his voice, he rarely stepped back. If something went wrong, it would be his responsibility to fix it. Very quickly, the workload became overwhelming. Writing under pressure wasn't new to him, but this was different. The Twilight Zone wasn't just a job, it was a shield. If it slipped, the old restrictions would return. That knowledge kept him working long hours, chain-smoking through drafts, pushing himself to maintain a standard that television production schedules were never designed to support. On screen, he appeared measured and composed, calmly guiding viewers into strange new worlds. Off-screen, the strain was beginning to show. Episodes piled up, deadlines tightened. The burden of carrying the show, creatively and symbolically, rested almost entirely on his shoulders. What had begun as a way to protect his voice was slowly consuming him. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Twilight Zone allowed Serling to say more than he ever could before, but it demanded more of him than any sponsor-driven drama ever had. And as the series gained popularity, the expectation that he would continue at that pace only grew. Success hadn't freed him from pressure. It just changed its shape. He tried to share the load. Other writers came in, talented people, sharp thinkers, but Serling remained the center of gravity. Scripts crossed his desk constantly. If something fell off, he fixed it. If a theme drifted too far from the show's moral spine, he pulled it back. He'd created a space where ideas could survive, and he felt personally responsible for guarding it. Over time, that responsibility wore him down. The work never let up. The pressure to maintain quality never went away. And even as the show became iconic, Serling found himself facing the same problem again. Only now, it wasn't sponsors pushing back. Some ideas just couldn't be hidden inside fantasy or metaphor. A few truths refused to be dressed up. And when those stories couldn't be told at all, the frustration came rushing back. By the later seasons, his exhaustion was no longer subtle. Serling was still sharp, still articulate, but the urgency that once fueled him had begun to turn inward. The cigarette that had always been a prop was now a constant. The workload that once felt necessary now felt relentless. When the Twilight Zone finally ended, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like release, tempered by the quiet realization that the industry hadn't changed. The workaround had worked, but only temporarily. The same forces that had shaped television in the 1950s were still there, waiting. In the years that followed, Serling stepped back from the weekly grind. He taught, he lectured, He spoke to students about writing, about responsibility, about the importance of clarity in a medium that often rewards ambiguity. In classrooms, he found something television had rarely given him: time to think and space to speak without interruption. His health, however, continued to decline. Years of overwork and constant stress had taken their toll. The voice remained unmistakable, but the body carrying it was wearing out. When Serling died in 1975, he was only 50 years old. Rod Serling's legacy wasn't just a television series. It was proof that ideas could survive, even thrive, inside a commercial medium, but only at a cost. He showed generations of writers what television could be, but what it might demand in return. Serling paid that price quietly and left the rest to us. This is Rich from Rerun Zone. Thanks for spending a few minutes with me today. Like, share, subscribe, and have a good night.